Imagine a country so incredibly wealthy that its government just paid for everything. Free education, free world-class healthcare, absolutely no taxes. This was a nation where citizens chartered jets for weekend shopping trips, and the national airline flew with more crew than passengers. Imagine a tiny remote island, smaller than most international airports, that for a time held the title for one of the highest per capita incomes on Earth. For a brief, glittering moment in history, this wasn't a fantasy. This was the reality for the people of Nauru. This was a nation so rich the police chief famously bought a Lamborghini he was too big to even fit into. A place where, as the wilder rumors claim, money was practically worthless. A microscopic dot in the Pacific Ocean, which, in the 1970s, had citizens who were, on average, wealthier than almost anyone on the planet. They had it all. Then the bottom fell out. This is what's left. A ghostly lunar landscape of jagged, sterile rock. How did one of the world's richest countries manage to bankrupt itself, poison its own people, and turn a paradise into a wasteland? This is the shocking story of Nauru's dizzying rise and its catastrophic fall. It's a tale of colonial greed, unimaginable excess, and a curse that haunts resource-rich nations to this day. And the lessons it holds have never been more relevant. Before we get into this extraordinary story of Paradise Lost, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We unpack the world's most unbelievable true stories here, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Understanding how our world works, and sometimes fails, is more important now than ever. Act 1. The Golden Age, White Gold and the End of Innocence. Our story begins on a speck of land in Micronesia, a raised coral atoll just 21 square kilometers in size, so isolated it's easy to miss on a world map. For centuries, passing sailors knew it as Pleasant Island, a name given by British whaler John Fern in 1798. He was captivated by its lush, tropical greenery and the welcoming canoes that paddled out to greet his ship. Life for the 12 clans of Nauru was simple, sustained by the ocean's bounty and the coconuts and pandanus fruits that grew along the coast. It was a world away from the industrial empires carving up the globe. But Pleasant Island was sitting on a secret. A secret that would be both its greatest blessing and its most devastating curse. The secret was bird droppings. Millions of years of them. As one of the only landmasses for thousands of miles, Nauru was a critical pit stop for migratory seabirds. Over countless millennia, their guano accumulated, reacted with the coral limestone beneath it, and through a slow geological alchemy, transformed into a deposit of almost pure phosphate of lime. This was nature's super fertilizer, an incredibly potent substance that could dramatically boost crop yields. And in a world with a booming population and tired soils, this white gold was about to become extremely valuable. For years, the secret lay hidden in plain sight. Then, in 1899, a strange rock propping open a door in a Sydney company office caught the eye of a young prospector named Albert Ellis. He'd been told it was a piece of petrified wood from Nauru. But his geologist's intuition screamed otherwise. He tested it. The results were stunning. The rock was 78% pure phosphate, one of the highest concentrations ever found. Ellis had just stumbled upon one of the richest phosphate deposits on Earth. In 1906, the newly formed Pacific Phosphate Company, a British-German venture, struck a deal with the German administration controlling the island. They were granted the right to mine the phosphate for 999 years. In exchange for a pittance in royalties to the Nauruan people, just pennies per ton, the age of innocence on Pleasant Island was over. The age of exploitation had begun. Huge cantilevers, like giant metallic arms, were built on the coast to load the phosphate onto ships. A railway was laid to haul the white gold from the island's interior, an area the locals called Topside, for the next 60 years. Nauru's wealth was stripped away and shipped to farms in Australia and New Zealand, making their fields fertile while leaving Nauru's heartland progressively more scarred. The profits flowed to London, Melbourne, and Berlin. The Nauruans themselves, the landowners, saw almost none of it. Colonial powers administered the island, first Germany, then after World War I, a trust of Australia, Britain, and New Zealand. During World War II, the island was seized by Japan. The occupation was brutal, halting mining and leading to the deportation and death of hundreds of Nauruans. But after the war, the mining machine roared back to life under Australian administration. By the 1960s, a new generation of Nauruans, led by the formidable chief Hammer Darabert, began to demand what was rightfully theirs. They didn't just want a fairer slice of the royalties. They wanted control. They wanted their island back. After years of tense negotiations, on January 31, 1968, Nauru became the world's smallest independent republic. It was a moment of immense pride. But the true liberation came 2 years later, in 1970. The new government of Nauru did something unprecedented. They bought the entire phosphate industry from Australia for 21 million Australian dollars. For the first time, the profits from Nauru's white gold would flow to the people of Nauru. And the profits were astronomical. The timing was perfect. A global commodities boom sent phosphate prices soaring. Suddenly, this tiny nation of just a few thousand people was swimming in cash. By the mid-1970s, Nauru had the second highest per capita GDP on the planet, trailing only Saudi Arabia. Some estimates put the per capita income at an incredible $50,000 a year, at a time when the average American earned less than half of that. By the numbers, Nauru had become one of the richest countries in the world. The transformation was immediate and absolute. Life became a dream. The government, flush with cash, created a welfare state that was the envy of the world. There were no taxes whatsoever. Healthcare was completely free, and if you needed specialized treatment, the government would fly you to Australia and cover every single bill. Education was free all the way through university, anywhere in the world. Housing was provided. Electricity was free. Every Nauruan was a beneficiary of the state's unbelievable wealth. With no need to work, the backbreaking labor of mining was done by immigrant workers from Kiribati, Tuvalu, and China. Life became a leisurely pursuit of pleasure. And the spending was legendary. It was absurd. It was biblical in its excess. Nauruans, who had lived a subsistence lifestyle for millennia, were suddenly handed stacks of cash. They went on shopping sprees that became the stuff of legend. With only one main road circling the island, they imported luxury sports cars at a dizzying rate. The famous story goes that the police chief imported a gleaming Lamborghini, only to discover he was too large to comfortably fit inside it. When a car got a flat tire or broke down, it was often just easier to abandon it on the side of the road and buy a new one. The island slowly became a graveyard for rusting Mercedes and half-driven Porsches. If they got bored of shopping on the island, they did what anyone with limitless money would do. They went abroad. The national airline, Air Nauru, was established. At its peak, it had a fleet of 7 Boeing jets, an astonishing number for a nation of fewer than 10,000 people. This was basically a national taxi service. It was said that Nauruans would decide on a whim to fly to Fiji for a weekend getaway or to Melbourne for a shopping trip, chartering an entire jet for themselves and their friends. Flights often took off with only a handful of passengers, leading to the joke that it was cheaper to fly Air Nauru than to take a bus. The government itself was the biggest spender of all. They built modern, air-conditioned homes for everyone. They constructed state-of-the-art schools and a gleaming new hospital. But their ambitions went far beyond their tiny island. To secure the nation's future for when the phosphate inevitably ran out, they created a sovereign wealth fund, the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust. The idea was sound. Invest the windfall in assets around the world to provide an income for generations to come. The trust began acquiring a massive portfolio. They built Nauru House in Melbourne, at the time the city's tallest skyscraper, a glistening 52-story monument to their wealth. They bought hotels across Australia, the Pacific, the US, and the UK. They bought fleets of ships and planes. At its zenith, the trust was valued at over $1 billion Australian dollars. The future seemed not just secure, but dazzlingly bright. For a generation, Nauru was a paradise of consumption. A place where want had been abolished, replaced by a culture of instant gratification. They were the rich kids of the Pacific, a tiny island that had hit the geological lottery and was living a life most of the world couldn't even imagine. But beneath this glittering surface, a deep and irreversible crisis was taking hold. The very source of their wealth was eating their nation alive, and the habits of easy money were planting the seeds of their own destruction. Act 2. The Unseen Crisis and the Great Fall. While Nauruans were living the dream, the island itself was being consumed by a nightmare. The source of their wealth, the phosphate, wasn't just a layer of soil. To get to it, you had to strip mine the land. This meant clearing the native forests, scraping away the topsoil, and digging out the phosphate that lay in the crevices of an ancient coral reef. What was left behind wasn't a field that could be replanted. It was a hellscape. An apocalyptic, jagged forest of limestone pinnacles, some as high as 15 meters, sharp as razors, stretched across the island's interior. This landscape, known as topside, became completely unusable. You couldn't farm it. You couldn't build on it. It was a dead zone. By the 1980s, this relentless process had rendered a staggering 80% of Nauru's land area uninhabitable and infertile. The island, once called Pleasant Island, was now just a narrow habitable ring of coastline encircling a barren skeletal core. Nauru was literally digging its own grave and selling it by the shipload. This environmental catastrophe triggered a second, more insidious crisis, a public health disaster. With virtually no farmable land left, traditional agriculture collapsed. The Nauruans, who for centuries had lived on a healthy diet of fish, coconuts, and root vegetables, became almost totally dependent on imported, processed foods from Australia and New Zealand. Shipments brought in canned meat, white rice, sugary sodas, and junk food. The results were predictable and devastating. The combination of a sedentary lifestyle, since no one needed to work, and a diet high in fat, sugar, and salt caused obesity rates to explode. By the late 20th century, Nauru had become the most overweight country in the world, with over 70% of the population classified as obese. And with obesity came its terrifying partner, type 2 diabetes. The island developed the highest rate of diabetes the world has ever seen, affecting over 40% of the adult population at its peak. This, in turn, led to epidemic levels of heart disease, kidney failure, and stroke. Life expectancy plummeted. The world's richest country was becoming one of its sickest. The free state-of-the-art healthcare system was now completely overwhelmed, fighting a tidal wave of diseases caused directly by the lifestyle the phosphate money had created. As the island's physical and biological health crumbled, so too did its financial health. The Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, the nation's billion-dollar nest egg, was supposed to guarantee its future. Instead, it became a masterclass in gross mismanagement and mind-bogglingly foolish investments. The trust was handled not by seasoned international fund managers, but by government officials and their advisors, who often lacked financial expertise and were susceptible to risky schemes and outright corruption. The investments grew stranger and stranger. But no venture was more infamous, more symbolic of Nauru's hubris, than a West End musical. In 1993, a financial advisor convinced the government to invest £2 million, a figure that would eventually balloon to a loss of around $7 million Australian dollars, into a lavish London musical he had co-written. It was called Leonardo, the Musical, A Portrait of Love. The plot was a fictional love affair between Leonardo da Vinci and the Mona Lisa. The show was an absolute catastrophe. It was savaged by critics for its nonsensical script and was plagued by production problems. The British press had a field day, gleefully pointing out that a musical about one of history's greatest artists was being financed by bird droppings. On opening night, the president of Nauru and his delegation reportedly beamed with pride, while critics in the audience sharpened their knives. The show closed in a matter of weeks, and Nauru's entire investment vanished into the annals of London's greatest theatrical flops. This was just one example of a much larger pattern. The trust's portfolio was hemorrhaging money. Risky currency trading, bad property deals, and ventures that defied all logic drained the fund. Millions were lost. The trust was being treated like a personal piggy bank by politicians and their associates. Allegations of widespread corruption and a culture of financial recklessness spiraled out of control. By the early 1990s, the two crises, the depletion of the phosphate and the depletion of the trust fund, were on a collision course with reality. The easy-to-mine phosphate was running out. Exports plummeted. Government revenue collapsed. Suddenly, the money-printing press ground to a halt. But the government, used to limitless spending, didn't adjust. They kept the bloated public service running and the free services going. To do this, they began borrowing from their own future, taking massive loans from the Nauru Phosphate Royalties Trust, and treating the fund's capital as income. It was financial suicide. When that wasn't enough, they started taking external loans, mortgaging the trust's prime assets, like Nauru House in Melbourne, just to get cash. The fall, when it came, was swift and brutal. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Nauru was effectively bankrupt. The government defaulted on its loans. International creditors sent in the receivers. They seized the country's prized overseas assets. Nauru House, the gleaming symbol of their former wealth, was sold off to pay the debts. Air Nauru, once the private jet service of the Pacific, was grounded after its last plane was repossessed at a Melbourne airport. On the island, the collapse was felt in every corner of life. Government paychecks stopped. The Bank of Nauru failed, wiping out citizens' savings. The free healthcare system crumbled. The hospital ran out of medicine. The power grid flickered and died, plunging the island into darkness. In 2003, the nation's telecommunications link was shut down due to unpaid bills, cutting Nauru off from the rest of the world for nearly 2 months. The dream was over. The party had ended, and the hangover was a national apocalypse. The country that once had one of the highest per capita incomes in the world was now a failed state, dependent on foreign aid just to survive. The paradise built on phosphate had decayed into a wasteland of debt, disease, and despair. Act 3. The Aftermath and the Devil's Bargain. The new millennium found Nauru a broken nation. The landscape was a ruin, the treasury was empty, and the people were left stranded in the wreckage of their extravagant dream. Desperate for any source of cash, the government turned to a series of controversial and often humiliating schemes to stay afloat. For a time, Nauru became a notorious tax haven and a center for money laundering. Hundreds of shell banks were registered on the island, offering anonymity to anyone who wanted to move money without scrutiny, with allegations that billions were laundered through this system. Under immense international pressure and the threat of crippling sanctions, Nauru was forced to shut this industry down. Another scheme involved selling diplomatic recognition. In the bizarre game of geopolitical ping-pong, Nauru would recognize contested territories in exchange for aid from larger powers like Russia or switch its recognition between China and Taiwan, depending on which offered a better financial package. It was a desperate attempt to monetize its own sovereignty. But the most significant and controversial source of income came from a deal with a former colonial master. In 2001, Nauru signed an agreement with Australia that would come to define its modern identity. It was called the Pacific Solution. Australia, facing a rising number of asylum seekers arriving by boat, needed a place to house them offshore while their claims were processed. Nauru, desperate for money, agreed to host detention centers in exchange for millions in Australian aid. And so, the island that was once a destination for shopping sprees became a prison island. For much of the next 2 decades, Nauru became a key pillar of Australia's hardline immigration policy. Barbed wire-topped camps were built on the scarred lands of Topside, housing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of men, women, and children. The deal provided a vital lifeline for Nauru's government, becoming its single largest source of revenue, at times accounting for almost 2/3 of the state's income. The Australian aid propped up the flailing public service and kept the lights on, but the moral cost was immense. The detention centers became synonymous with human suffering. Reports from human rights groups painted a horrifying picture of neglect, abuse, and a profound mental health crisis among detainees trapped in a legal and psychological limbo for years. Nauru's name was splashed across international headlines not for its wealth, but for the horror unfolding within its facilities. The nation had traded its soul for survival, becoming a client state of Australia, a jailer for hire in the Pacific. Today, life in Nauru is a study in paradox. The population hovers around 12,500 people. The economy remains fragile, propped up by Australian regional processing centers and the sale of fishing licenses. GDP growth is modest, but the nation is incredibly vulnerable to any change in Australian policy. The health crisis that began in the boom years continues. Diabetes and heart disease are still rampant, a lasting legacy of the dramatic shift in diet and lifestyle. The environmental damage is, for the most part, permanent. The Nauru Rehabilitation Corporation was established to try and restore the mined-out lands, a monumental task. But progress has been agonizingly slow. In over 2 decades, only a tiny fraction of the ruined landscape has been rehabilitated. The scale of the destruction is so overwhelming that some believe restoring Topside could take a millennium. And now, a new threat looms: climate change. With 80% of the island's interior being a high, jagged plateau, the entire population lives on the narrow coastal ring. Rising sea levels pose an existential threat to the only habitable part of the nation. There's nowhere to retreat. The only option for moving inland is to first fix the wasteland they created. there are glimmers of hope. The government is exploring secondary mining, sifting through the limestone pinnacles for lower-grade phosphate. And there are internationally supported efforts to plant trees and restore some of what was lost. But the overwhelming reality of Nauru is that of a cautionary tale. It is the ultimate example of the resource curse. The resource curse is a phenomenon where countries with an abundance of natural resources, like oil, diamonds, or phosphate, often end up with less economic growth and worse development outcomes. The sudden wealth crowds out other industries, fuels corruption, and fosters a culture of consumption rather than production. Nauru's story is a textbook case. The phosphate money was so easy that it made developing any other part of the economy pointless. The wealth was concentrated in the hands of the state, creating enormous opportunities for mismanagement. And because the wealth was simply dug out of the ground, it fostered a belief that the party would never end. They failed to plan for the day the music would stop. Conclusion. From one of the world's richest nations to a bankrupt wasteland. From Pleasant Island to a detention camp. The story of Nauru is a tragedy on a national scale. It's a shocking demonstration of how a blessing can become a curse, and how a dream of infinite wealth can decay into a nightmare of environmental ruin and social collapse. They were given a geological lottery ticket that paid out for a single generation, and in the process, they lost their health, their land, and their future. The jagged limestone pinnacles that scar the island today aren't just a physical landscape. They're a monument to colonial exploitation, to short-sighted greed, and to the devastating consequences of living as if there's no tomorrow. The story of Nauru serves as a stark warning. In a world still grappling with resource dependency, the lessons of this tiny island are more critical than ever. It forces us to ask, what is the true price of wealth? And what happens when the thing we depend on finally runs out? The people of Nauru are now living in the answer. What do you think? Could Nauru have avoided this collapse, or was it doomed from the moment that phosphate was discovered? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious to hear what you think. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. The stories we have coming up will continue to challenge the way you see the world. See you in the next one.